Gemini is simply here to wake us up, much like the magician, much like the sorcerer's apprentice, much like the coyote in Native American tradition, which was also called the trickster. You always see Coyote wandering around in all the Native American stories, who is always there to trip you up when you least expect it. And it's very much like Jiminy Cricket, or very much like Mickey Mouse in the movie Fantasia, and the story Fantasia, the Sorcerer's Apprentice, if anybody's ever seen that. Here we have little Mickey Mouse, of course, being the Sorcerer's Apprentice. And of course, we have the wonderful, magnificent Sorcerer, who's actually a much more developed version of Gemini, who's actually moved into the sign of Aquarius, because Aquarius is really the developed version of Gemini. And yet, the sorcerer goes to sleep, and the sorcerer's apprentice has seen a few quote-unquote tricks, and he thinks he can make things happen just like the sorcerer. And of course, if you've seen the story or read the story or looked at the story, you know that he hasn't learned enough. And this is an interesting thing, too, because Gemini energy can be very much a dilettante kind of energy. It knows a little bit about a lot of things, but it doesn't always have the patience to pursue or to go into great depth about one or two particular things, unless, of course, again, there's other elements in the horoscope that give more of a solid research kind of orientation. And so they very much are dilettantes, and may not always seem, when you initially meet them, to be that deep, and they may not be. And yet, no one is a pure Gemini. Everybody is a mix of everything. And so for that reason, we really can't judge them. I always hear people saying, gee, I don't know if I want to go out with Geminis, or I don't want to go do this or that with Geminis, because you never know. But yet, the one thing that's very, very true about them that is probably very untrue about the other 11 signs of the zodiac is that they're a tremendous amount of fun. This is a group that has one of the world's best senses of humor. They love humor. They're always curious. Their mind is always open, and it's a very open-minded group. They enjoy and they appreciate intelligence. They enjoy and appreciate intelligent discussion. They never get tired of learning. They're eternal students. And if you're that kind of a person, can be exciting to be with, as long as you don't try to fence them in or hook them in and reel them in like a fish. They always have to have a long, long leash, much like their opposite sign, Sagittarius. I always call Sagittarius, and also Gemini, the married bachelor or the married bachelorette. And they have been, if you've read the cookbook, popular astrology books, you always read about Gemini being somewhat unfaithful in relationship because they get bored with the relationship. That's generally why that occurs. Now, that does not mean if that you are involved currently with a Gemini personality that they are being unfaithful to you. Actually, they have the capability of being extremely faithful if, in fact, certain needs are met. First of all, they have to be consistently intellectually stimulated and intellectually surprised, number one and number two. And number three, they have to see that you're always interested in all the new things and changing and movable and mobile and willing to make change in your life just like they are. If that's going on, there is no problem living with a Gemini personality. If that's not going on, then there definitely is a problem. Because if you recall, one of their issues is the issue of broken agreements, and they can just as easily justify breaking an agreement in a relationship as well as keeping one if, in fact, the cards are not stacked in their favor. Now, what I'd like to do is talk about how in each house of the zodiac, Gemini operates or reacts. The zodiac has 12 houses, and each house represents a different area of life. The first house is, of course, the ego and the self-expression, and we go all the way through the 12th house, which is the end of the zodiac. And this will particularly be appropriate for those who have Gemini rising. In other words, if you're born at the time of day at which Gemini was there to greet you at your birth. But this also applies for those who have a lot of Gemini planets and Gemini sun signs. If we look at the first house of the horoscope, this is always the house that physically shows what we look like, number one. It also indicates our identity, our self-expression, and of course, our ego. And of course, since we're talking about Gemini, we can begin by putting Gemini at this position. The first thing, as we mentioned earlier, that you will probably see with the Gemini rising is that they're usually not that big of a person. There's usually more of a diminutive kind of quality. If they aren't diminutive, generally speaking, you'll see this kind of nervous, not necessarily nervous, but active energy about them where they can't sit still for very long. They may not appear to have a lot of patience when you first meet them. They'll be the one in the crowd that's talking a lot, or carrying the books, or, who has 2 or 3 bags with them full of books. They're the ones that usually have 2 or 3 pairs of glasses. Classical, I always loved the film, The Revenge of the Nerds. I always loved that. I always thought of those characters as being terribly wonderful Gemini characters, and I'm always reminded of their pockets, the engineers, when they carry their pockets full of writing utensils, which is really the magic wand for Gemini. The magic wand is associated with pens and pencils and everything. And there's like 6 or 7 pens in a plastic thing so that it doesn't leak into their shirt. That movie was so typical, and it's such a great film about Gemini, because in the end, even though they were quote unquote nerdy, because of their brains, they won, and in the end, Gemini wins because of their brains. They have the mind that no one can beat. But the other side of Gemini rising is, too, that they have a chameleon-like presentation. One minute they can be one way with you, and the next minute they can be absolutely the opposite. So that when you meet them again, they may treat you very differently, or actually physically look very differently. You may also see them being not only diminutive, which we talked about, but people who are always moving around with their hands, who are either on the jogging trail or riding bikes, or who have 6 or 7 projects going at one time. So it's generally pretty easy. It's one of the easiest rising signs to be able to see, especially if it's right in the middle of the sign of the zodiac, because it's very, very active. Now we move to the second house of the zodiac, and this is always the house that shows, number one, the immediate money and cash that's available to us and how we do spend it. It shows our resourcefulness. It shows our values, our talents, and our skills. And you can put the sign of Cancer here, which follows the sign of Gemini. And this would suggest, if this is the house of how we spend our money, and Cancer is a very moody sign, that very definitely Geminis are moody spenders, that they will spend their money on food and security. In fact, you see a lot of them when they're doing any kinds of investing, that they will be investing in Cancer kinds of products or projects, like food businesses or food companies or restaurants or antiques or houses or films. This is another thing too, because Cancer rules the sign of films. And in fact, one of their great skills or talents may be in the film industry. And they always like to have cash in their pocket. That's one thing that's kind of interesting about a really true Gemini rising, is that they may be very active and very busy, but if you open up their wallet, they'll generally speaking have a lot of cash in there, or either credit cards that makes cash readily available to them, or a way of having something. There's other groups of people that walk around that are okay with not having anything in their pockets. This is not one of those groups. If we go to the third house, we look at the house of communications. This is always the house of not only communications, but how our brothers and sisters are, or how we see them, rather, and how our relatives are, how we think and process thought, and how we write, how we learn, in other words, the techniques that we use to learn. And you can put the sign of Leo here, which is a fire sign, which would suggest that in terms of communications, and of course we've been saying this all along, that this is a group that is very out there with their communications. Whatever's on their mind, they say it, sometimes to the detriment of others and sometimes not to the detriment of others. They can, since Leo is definitely a sign that likes attention, monopolize conversations. Gemini risings, or people who have a lot of Gemini in the horoscope, really don't know when to put a lid on it, actually, to be quite frank, because the Leo on the third house says, well, of course, everybody's going to listen to me. Everybody wants to hear what I have to say. And generally speaking, what they have to say is quite creative. They're creative communicators. They're a lot of fun to talk with. Leo is a sign of fun. And literally, when they need to come up with some type of problem solving, they have a creative outlet. Again, Leo is very definitely that way. It would suggest that their brothers and sisters may actually be fairly outgoing and fairly social also, because Leo, of course, is the sign of fairly outgoing people, and that relatives that they've known have had fairly big hearts. Actually, they may have a better relationship with brothers, sisters, cousins, aunts, and uncles than they do with mothers and fathers, which is very interesting. The very immediate family may not always be as close to them as they are with the other relatives. And in fact, it may be that their other relatives may have more of an appreciation of their talents and gifts, far more than their mother or father might, because they're so out there, and the Leo's on the third house. If we go to the fourth house always indicates our root family, in other words, the family from which we came. Usually it's also traditionally our mother. Sometimes it's our father, but traditionally it shows the mother. And we can put the sign of Virgo here. Now, that's interesting because Virgo is the sign of cleanliness and being clean and neat and precise. And it's very interesting. If we look at this country, the United States was born, or rather incorporated, or the declaration they say was signed somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, which makes this country a Cancer country, always preoccupied with food and families, with Gemini rising, always preoccupied with eternal youth. Now, it's very funny. I always laugh because if you see Virgo on the 4th house, this would generally speaking mean cleanliness. Well, if you look at the commercials that are blasted all over the radio waves and the television waves in this country, they're always preoccupied with the cleanest shirts in town and the cleanest floors and bathrooms in towns, too. And so for that reason, especially someone who has Gemini rising may be extremely, almost to the point of being compulsive about their house being clean and neat, even though they themselves have a very difficult time staying organized. In other words, for some reason, they're expecting some magic fairy to show up and do it, even though they don't have the capacity to do it. But they really do require that their environment has some type of order. And actually, that makes a lot of sense because if they don't have order in a piece of their life, that can be particularly disruptive to their minds because their mind is always going in 100 different directions. If they don't have a house that's clean and neat, there's always going to be one place in the house, one room, or one file cabinet or something that is precise, neat, and everything is readily available to them. It's sort of like their grounding cord so they can exist. It would also say, since this is the house of the mother and we have the sign of Virgo here, that they might have seen their mother as selfless. In other words, a person who didn't think too much for themselves, they thought more about the members of the family. They might have seen the mother as cool or distant or precise and efficient and effective. They might have even seen the mother, since Virgo is the grain goddess or Demetra, the goddess of the harvest, as someone who, quote unquote, tilled the soil. In other words, was the root for the family or the one that was there to make things work in the family. That does not necessarily mean, however, that they were that close to the mother, which is going back to the story of Maya, who is the mother of Hermes or Mercury, who's only in the story to birth him. After that, he's sort of on his own by his own wits. If you go to the 5th house, the house of always the house of children of either our bodies or our minds, and it's also the house of creativity and romance, we can put the sign of Libra right here, another air sign. And this is wonderful because Libra is a very social, very sophisticated, very refined, very creative sign of the zodiac. It's also very fair and very just, which would suggest that there's a tremendous amount of creativity in this group of people, that they themselves enjoy young people, probably because they themselves are children themselves. They love pleasure. They can be very, very romantic. Geminis can be probably a lot better in a romantic situation. In other words, dating, rather than a quote-unquote long-term committed relationship, because the sign that's on the house of marriage and partnership is very different than the sign that's on the house of creativity and romance. They can be very romantic. They can know exactly the right things to do to wheel and deal their romantic partner. They can also be indecisive about lovers. In other words, Libra is a sign of the scales. Oh, this is a good thing to do today. Oh, I think I'll change my mind today. Should I do this? Should I do that? So they may not be able to make up their minds or make commitments. That might be one of the problems in long-term relationships because they're always looking for perfection. They're always looking for the perfect partner, the most even, sophisticated, intelligent, beautiful, gorgeous, together, financially secure partner. And the truth of the matter is, of course, that if we were that perfect, we would be God. We wouldn't be people. And so oftentimes there's a disappointment as a result of wanting to have the perfect relationship. And they'll be very much involved in the relationship as long as no one tries to get too deep or too connected to them, because they need to keep feeling as though they have a tremendous amount of freedom. Libra is also the sign of, well, music is sometimes associated with Libra, also the law and the legal systems and the textile industry and the fabric industry. So some of the areas, one of the few areas that they may be very good is in one of these areas as far as creativity goes. If we go to the 6th house, this is always the house of not only work, how we work and how we manage our time, but also how we serve. and also how we deal with our health. And we can put the sign of Scorpio right on this house. Now, Scorpio is the most obsessive compulsive sign of the zodiac. So one thing that is very, very true about Gemini, even though they may seem distracted and have 1,000 things going on at one time, if they love what they're doing, they can be very compulsive and obsessive about their work schedule. In fact, they may put more time and energy into their work and service schedule than they do with any other part of their life. They may expect all the people that work with them to be just as perfect in what they're doing and precise as they are, which, is of course a myth. Not everybody can be the same. Not only can they be obsessed with work, but they may also be obsessed with maintaining health and being healthy, because this is the house of health and the right diet and the right exercise programs. They may not know when to give things a rest. Since Scorpio rules the reproductive or the excretory system, these are other parts of the body. If in fact their schedule's gotten so tight and they're not able to have relaxing time, which especially being a Gemini, you need to have playtime. One of the areas of the body that may back up or kick up or give you problems would be the excretory or the reproductive system, since Scorpio rules that part of the body, especially if there's a block in expression in the throat, which is ruled by Venus and Mercury. If we go to the 7th house, we have the house here of marriage and legal partnerships. In other words, it's not only marriage, but how you are as a Gemini or a Gemini rising in long-term, committed, legal relationships. Now, the sign of Sagittarius goes right here, and Sagittarius was mentioned just a bit earlier, which is the sign of the married bachelor or the married bachelorette. So one of the things, as was said earlier, is that in a long-term relationship, a person who has a lot of Gemini in their chart needs to feel that they have a very, very long leash and that they have total freedom. They have this motto called "Don't fence me in." Sagittarius on the 7th would also suggest that the kind of partnerships, long-term legal partnerships in business or personal, that you prefer would be people who are also very, very independent and who have, as the sign of Sagittarius would indicate, vision, and who love to travel and who love to learn and who love to study, because Sagittarius is associated with the house of travel and higher education and foreign countries and foreign peoples and import and export. These are very definitely areas that would be, you would like your partner to be interested in those things, and you would prefer or have a partner that way. It might suggest too, since Sagittarius is a sign of foreign people or foreign countries, that you may actually, for a long-term committed relationship, be more attracted to foreigners rather than, for example, if you're American-born, you may be more attracted to foreigners or foreign cultures as a permanent partner than you would to your own culture. It might also suggest that you have a tendency to attract to you, and that you do prefer also teachers, because Sagittarius is definitely the sign of teachers and people who train people. Would also suggest too that other people see you as a teacher and a trainer. If we move to the 8th house always indicates how we deal with our resources with other people, both money and talent resources. It shows our attitude towards our sexuality, and it shows our ability to attract resources from others to us. You can put the sign of Capricorn right here. Now, it would suggest right off the top that it may be very, very difficult, because Capricorn is ruled by Saturn, which can be delays or difficulty. It may be very difficult to build future security for yourself when you're a younger Gemini. However, as you get older, since Capricorn is very definitely a sign of late bloomers, it would suggest that you are more able as you get older, especially past 40 or 45, to be able to put together your security for your future, your investments, etc. It might suggest that you might not be so willing to spend money on investments or take risks on investments, maybe more conservative, that there may be some type of a fear about the ability to attract resources to you, which of course does change as you get older. You're very definitely late bloomers in the area of investments, in the area of sexuality, and in the area that has the ability to attract resources from other people, because Capricorn is very definitely a late blooming planet. It's also very earthy. And once you can integrate organization and focus into your life, because Capricorn is very definitely the management sign that rules organization and focus, once that's brought in, which generally speaking, even between the ages of 28 and 30, you might experience this, but also when you hit about 40 to 45, then and only then can you really experience the ability to work with other people and really by working with other people's resources, thereby gaining your own. Capricorn is also the sign of builders and construction and management. So these are, again, some other industries that you might do very, very well in and that you could do financially well in, and it would be very satisfying to you as you get older. If you look at the ninth house is always the house of philosophy, belief systems, education, and it's considered to be the house of the higher mind. In other words, the bigger ideas, the visual, the visionary ideas. And the sign of Aquarius, another air sign, which is very much a big picture kind of sign, goes on this house, which would suggest, as far as thinking and philosophy goes, especially Gemini rising types, they're definitely radical thinkers. Aquarius is a sign of extremes and ideas that are usually 20 to 30 years ahead of their time. And this is very definitely a quality that Gemini holds, is they have the ability to see far, far further than any of us can imagine, so that eventually time catches up with them. They may be rather extremists in what their philosophy of life is. When everybody else is going left, they're going right. They may have had a rather, shall we say, eclectic, because Aquarius is definitely the sign of the eclectic, or a rather unconventional educational background. They might have learned several different things that, when you look at them from the outside looking in, seem somewhat disassociated, but really in the end, they really come together beautifully. And one of the areas that they may do very, very well in is either computers, electronics, video, audio equipment, especially speakers. These are very gifted speakers. Aquarius is the sign of charismatic speakers and people that can kind of get a crowd going to sway them to do one thing or another. In other words, radical change or radical movements. And this is a group. Geminis are very good at doing that, working with groups and speaking to groups and really inspiring them and getting them going and putting a fire under them to get them to change their thinking. If we go to the 10th house, this is the sign of Pisces is placed here. Now, the 10th house is the highest point in the horoscope. It represents the career that we came here to do, or basically not only career, because some people don't have careers, but what we came here to do in our life, the end result of our life. It's our public standing. It also shows the way we saw our father. And you can put the sign of Pisces here, which is very, very sensitive. It would suggest that one of the things that you could be seen as by the public is that you are very, very sensitive. Now, Pisces rules the arts, music, theater, dance, the healing and health field. Pisces is a sign that takes things that don't work properly and somehow converts it into things that do work properly. So there's an ability to transform old ideas and thoughts and equipment, for example, into new ideas and thoughts and equipment. Pisces is a sign of seduction, so that does suggest that, especially someone who has Gemini rising, they have the ability to seduce the public into believing anything they want them to, because they're very good actors. You see a lot of actors that have this placement who are in the theater or who are dancers or in the music world. This might also suggest that there might be an affinity towards boats or fishing, that the oceans or the waters, or working with liquids or paint, or working with petroleum or plastics. These are some of the other industries. Since this is the house that represents how you saw your father, might have suggested that the father might not have been as strong a figure, or if it wasn't a strong figure, that the father was sort of comme ci, comme ça, well, whatever you want to do, you can do. Not real definitive about how things should be done, because Pisces is one of those signs that can't really quite make up its mind. Might suggest that there might have been either heavy denial in one of the family members, mother or father, or that there might have been a problem with alcoholism or drug addiction or food addiction of some sort, because Pisces is definitely the sign of addictions. But it's also the sign of spiritualism and mysticism, which might suggest, too, that you might have seen the father or the mother, depending on how you perceive either parent, as being rather mystical and spiritual and rather creative. There's two extremes with this sign. You can either view one parent as being one way or the other. It would also suggest that in the career, that a lot of what you do is much more sacrificial than maybe other people might realize, and that there might have been, especially in the early part of life, more of a disappointment in career. But as you get older, it's your creative babies become your career. So usually you see people who have created their own business or their own work out of their own ideas that have this kind of a placement later in life. If we look at the 11th house of the horoscope, this is always the house that indicates the goals that we have in our life. also the kinds of friends that we have and how we see our friends and how we socialize. And you can put the very aggressive, very assertive sign of Aries here, which says you put a lot of energy into friendships, a lot of energy into sociability, a lot of energy into goals, and a lot of energy into knowing who knows this person, who knows this person, who knows this person. In other words, you can walk down the street and know 10 people in the course of one afternoon who all know you, and you know them, but not particularly on a very deep level. It would also suggest that you really do fight for your friends and that you're almost like the warrior for your friends, that your friends or your associations or your acquaintances, they themselves may have pioneering goals and be pioneers or trailblazers in their own fields. There's a lot of passion that goes into social situations here. It might also suggest, too, that you may begin a lot of social situations that you don't necessarily finish, or begin a lot of goals or a lot of avenues that you'd like to pursue that you don't necessarily finish, because that's one of the negative sides of Aries, is that they start a lot of things, but they don't always finish them. But it would suggest that as far as also the world at large, in terms of what the world is looking at or the community at large, that there's a lot of spirit and a lot of passion that you put into that area, so that um, mass consciousness, creative consciousness, anything that has to do with the collective and the collective needs and the collective rights, this would be an area that a Gemini, especially Gemini rising, would be very good in. They'd have a lot of passion for that area, and they would be able to manifest or make change happen. And finally, we go to the very last house of the horoscope, the 12th house, which I always call the toxic waste management station of the chart, which sounds kind of odd, but it's an appropriate title, because everything has to pass through the 12th house before the birth, or before we return back to the beginning of the horoscope, which is where the identity is. And supposedly, right before the birth, this is where you are, kind of the void before the birth, which would also suggest that you store a lot of your spiritual gifts here and a lot of your talents and a lot of your hidden karmic needs or hidden karmic debts that need to be paid. So therefore, it also might be the blind spot. We can put the sign of Taurus here, which would suggest that there's a very, very deep side to Gemini, because Taurus has a very deep and very fertile side to it. But since it's in the 12th house of the horoscope for Gemini rising especially, it may not always be accessible because it's in the blind spot. And it may be in the life, the area, if you give yourself enough time, because the 12th house is where we need to take some time and space, that you can tap into that, because that can also be a very deep spiritual treasure chest for yourself. But there's a lot of fertility and a lot of ability to convert resources from one form to another if you simply take time to think about the concepts. And this is going back to the very beginning of what we were talking about, how they don't necessarily spend a lot of time. They're dilettantes in a lot of areas, but there is an ability to really become a master at a particular area, or a master of expertise in a particular area, but only if you take the time. The other side of this may be, too, that they may not always practice what they preach. In other words, Geminis are very good at reading information and conveying it, and really, really, truly, honestly believing it from their heart. But with Taurus on the 12th house, it may be that they really, really haven't let it sink into the heart too deeply. And if they give themselves more time, they really can really walk their talk and be much more grounded and have more of a foundation, which will not normally immediately be accessible to them. And to kind of close, back at the first house again, to kind of close, there is a wonderful, wonderful book that is still available in bookstores, believe it or not, and it was written around 500 or 600 years ago by a Japanese samurai master warrior whose name was Musashi, Musashi. And the book that he wrote was called A Book of Five Rings, which is actually used currently in a lot of major MBA and PhD programs in business throughout the country. And basically what the book is a samurai warrior manual that really talks about defensiveness, how to be defensive rather than offensive. And the book is divided into what we call 5 books, one for each of the elements: fire, water, earth, and wind. And the last book, of course, is the void. Since air and Gemini are associated with the wind, there's a quote from the wind book that says, "The spirit of attacking first is completely different from the spirit of being attacked." In other words, it's kind of like playing chess. You know if your opponent makes this move, this will be the consequence. And you know if your opponent makes this move, this will be the consequence. And that's the basic bottom line lesson for Gemini, is understanding the consequences of your actions.